The sun hung low over Fort Parker, painting the sprawling military base in shades of orange and gold. It was late September, that awkward time of year when the summer heat still clung to the land, but you could smell fall creeping in at the edges. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and distant salt water. They were close enough to the coast here in Southern California to feel it. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell sat alone in the base recreation center, nursing a cold coffee and trying to finish the report on her laptop. She had been stationed at Fort Parker for 3 months now, transferred here from a classified assignment she could never talk about. The other officers didn't know much about her. That was intentional. Sarah had learned long ago that a low profile was the best profile when you were a woman in the military, especially when you'd accomplished things most people would never believe. At 32 years old, Sarah looked younger. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight military bun. Her face was sun-weathered but still carried that youthful quality that made people instinctively underestimate her. She wore the gray physical training uniform like everyone else, nothing to distinguish her from any other officer on the base, but her eyes were different. They had seen things. They had made hard decisions. They had watched people's lives change in seconds. She didn't mind being overlooked. In fact, she preferred it. The recreation center wasn't crowded. A few soldiers were lifting weights in the corner. A young couple was playing pool. Sarah had chosen to sit here instead of in her small on-base apartment because she needed the noise. The silence of her apartment got too heavy sometimes. In the noise, she could think without remembering. That's when the three of them walked in. They were young, probably early 20s, which made them about 10 years younger than Sarah. They moved with the particular confidence of men who had never been told no. 2 of them were large, the kind of large that came from serious weight training and serious protein intake. The third was leaner, faster-looking, with a face that suggested he did most of the talking. Sarah noticed them because they were loud, and because they were heading directly toward her. The lean one approached first, pulling out the empty chair at her table and spinning it backward before sitting down like he'd just claimed the best seat in the house. His name tag said Jackson. His friends stayed standing. "Hey there, ma'am," he said, using the word ma'am in a way that made it sound more like an insult than a greeting. "Mind if we join you?" Sarah looked at him over the rim of her glasses. "Actually, I do mind. I'm working." "Come on," one of the larger men said. His voice came out deeper than you'd expect for his face. "We're just trying to be friendly. It's Friday night. You should be celebrating, not hunched over that computer." Sarah returned her attention to her screen. "I have work to finish." This was where most soldiers would have accepted the answer and moved on. Fort Parker had a clear hierarchy, a clear chain of command. But these 3 weren't picking up on the signals, or maybe they were choosing to ignore them. Sarah had seen it before, young men who figured the rules were suggestions, especially when no one was watching. Jackson leaned back in his chair with an amused smile. "You know, you're way too uptight. Someone should really help you loosen up. Maybe go on a date, have a few drinks, remember what it's like to have fun." Sarah closed her laptop. She turned to face them fully, and something in her expression must have registered because Jackson's confidence wavered for just a moment. But he recovered quickly, feeding off the energy of his friends. "Look," he said, "we've got access to a Jeep. We could take a drive down to the beach, grab some food at that nice place in town. You look like you could use a night out. Come on, what do you say?" What Sarah said next would have been clearer if she'd been rough, if she'd been angry, if she'd put any aggression into it at all. Instead, she kept her voice level and calm, which somehow made it worse, or better, depending on your perspective. "No, thank you, and I'd appreciate it if you'd step away from my table now." Jackson's jaw tightened, his smile faded. "You know, I was being nice. You don't have to be such a cold." Sarah stood up, and the change was remarkable. It wasn't that she was suddenly tall. She was average height, maybe 5'7". It wasn't that she was suddenly aggressive. She was perfectly still, perfectly calm. It was that every ounce of authority in her being suddenly became visible. It was like the room itself had shifted. "I'm going to say this once," she said. "You're going to walk away. You're going to understand that when someone tells you no, that's the complete sentence. You don't get to negotiate. You don't get to persuade. You get to accept. And you're going to do all of that right now." For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then Jackson laughed. It was a real laugh, and it seemed to break something in him, a barrier of self-awareness, perhaps. "Oh, that's rich. Is that supposed to scare us, lady?" Sarah didn't respond. She picked up her laptop and her coffee cup. "I'm done here. The rest of this is on you." She walked past them toward the door. For a second, it seemed like that would be the end of it. But as she passed by Jackson, he reached out and grabbed her wrist. It wasn't aggressive, not yet. It was more like he was trying to prove a point to show his friends that he wasn't intimidated. It was a mistake. The next 45 seconds unfolded like something from a training film, so fast that most of the other people in the recreation center barely registered what was happening. Sarah pivoted, using his own grip as an anchor point. Her other hand went to his arm, applying pressure to a specific nerve cluster. Jackson's confidence evaporated instantly, replaced by shock and pain. She controlled his momentum, spinning him forward and down into the nearest chair. He didn't fall. He didn't crash. He simply ended up sitting, the wind knocked out of him. The second soldier lunged forward, but Sarah was already moving. She sidestepped his charge, and as he passed, she struck him in the solar plexus with a palm strike that looked almost gentle but had all of her body weight behind it. He folded like a closing book. The third man was already backing away, hands up. He'd seen enough. "Whoa, whoa, whoa," he was saying. "We're done, we're done." Sarah stood there, not breathing hard, not shaking, not experiencing any of the adrenaline dump that would have affected a normal person in a normal fight. She looked exactly how she'd looked before, calm, composed, unmoved. "She's crazy," one of the soldiers on the other side of the room whispered. Sarah picked up her coffee cup from where she'd set it down. It hadn't even spilled. "Have a good evening, gentlemen," she said to Jackson and his friends. "And next time, listen the first time someone tells you no." She walked out of the recreation center and into the warm California night. Behind her, Jackson was still trying to catch his breath. His friend was massaging his chest, and the third soldier kept looking at the door where she'd exited, trying to process what had just happened. "What the hell was that?" Jackson gasped. But none of them could answer. None of them could explain how a woman who looked like a librarian had just dismantled 3 trained soldiers without seeming to break a sweat. None of them realized in that moment that they'd just made a very serious mistake. None of them knew who Sarah Mitchell really was. And they definitely didn't understand that they'd just set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. By Monday morning, the story had spread across Fort Parker like a wildfire through dry brush. 3 recruits got beat up by some lady officer. 3 military men, young and strong, and somehow a woman who weighed probably 130 pounds had put all 3 of them on the ground. The details got better with each retelling. She'd used some kind of martial arts. She'd broken someone's ribs. She'd threatened them. She'd been the one who started it. Sarah heard the versions as she moved through the base. In the commissary, she overheard 2 enlisted women talking, and the story they were telling bore almost no resemblance to what had actually happened. In the administrative offices, a sergeant was telling someone that the woman had been drunk and picking fights. By the time the rumor made it to the dining facility, apparently Sarah had used a weapon. She could have corrected the record. She could have filed an official report. She could have done any number of things. But Sarah had learned during her years of military service that the truth was less important than narrative, and narratives, once established, were nearly impossible to change. What she didn't expect was how quickly command would move. On Tuesday afternoon, Sarah was called to see Major Catherine Reeves, the base commander's second-in-command. Reeves was a hard woman in her late 50s, the kind of officer who had clawed her way up through a military that hadn't always been friendly to women, and who had developed a certain protective skepticism about female soldiers as a result. The office was cool, almost cold, with that generic military aesthetic, framed photographs of important people, motivational posters, the slight smell of coffee and old wood. Reeves sat behind her desk, and she didn't invite Sarah to sit. "Close the door," Reeves said. Sarah complied. "I've been fielding complaints all morning," Reeves continued, not looking up from the file on her desk. "From Jackson, from his 2 friends, from their commanding officer, and from the soldier who happened to be in the rec center at the time." She finally looked up at Sarah. "Would you like to tell me your version of events?" "Of course, ma'am," Sarah said. "The men approached me while I was working. When I declined their invitation to join them, Jackson grabbed my wrist. I defended myself." "You defended yourself," Reeves repeated, her tone suggesting skepticism. "By putting 3 trained soldiers on the ground in what multiple witnesses are saying was some kind of violent assault." "I didn't put them on the ground, ma'am. I controlled the situation. No one required medical attention." "That's not what Jackson is saying," Reeves opened the file. "According to his statement, you attacked him unprovoked. He says his friends came to help and you assaulted them as well. He's talking about filing charges with the civilian police." Sarah didn't move, she didn't blink, but internally something shifted. This was worse than she'd thought. This was the kind of thing that could end a career. "With respect, ma'am, that's not what happened. What I'm trying to figure out," Reeves said carefully, "is whether you've got some kind of anger management issue that we need to address. Whether there's something in your history that suggests this kind of violent behavior is normal for you." The question hung in the air between them. Sarah understood what Reeves was really asking. She was asking whether Sarah was the kind of woman who hurt men because she had something to prove, whether she was dangerous, whether she was a liability. "No, ma'am," Sarah said quietly. "Because I've looked at your record," Reeves continued. "Interesting thing about your record, it's almost empty. You joined the Army 12 years ago. You've had several assignments, but none of them are very detailed. Most of your recent work is classified. That makes it hard for me to know who you really are or what you're really capable of." Sarah said nothing. "So I'm going to be direct with you," Reeves said. "Jackson wants to press charges. His commanding officer wants you suspended pending investigation. And frankly, after what I've heard, I'm not inclined to defend you. The Army doesn't need officers who can't control themselves. Is that clear?" "Yes, ma'am." "You're suspended effective immediately, pending the outcome of a formal investigation. You'll turn in your base access credentials. You'll remain available for interviews. And Mitchell, if you've been hiding something in that classified file of yours, now would be a very good time to think about whether it might be relevant." Sarah left the office with her suspension orders in hand, and the clear understanding that her military career had just entered its final chapter. She'd spent 12 years building something that would end because 3 men had decided that her no wasn't enough. The next 2 days were a blur of official paperwork and uncomfortable silence. Sarah wasn't allowed in the office. She wasn't allowed to participate in her regular duties. The only thing she was allowed to do was sit in her on-base apartment and wait for the investigation to grind forward. Her lawyer, a young military prosecutor named Captain David Zhang, met with her on Wednesday evening at a coffee shop off base. "It's not good," Zhang said, not bothering with pleasantries. He was the kind of direct that Sarah appreciated. "Jackson's got 2 witnesses to back up his story. The other witness in the rec center is giving conflicting statements, and without more detail about what actually happened, it's going to be hard to build a defense." "What do they want?" Sarah asked. "A dishonorable discharge at minimum. Jackson is pushing for civilian charges too. Assault and battery. He's claiming damages, emotional distress, medical bills for the bruises." "The bruises he got by being surprised and untrained," Sarah said flatly. "Yes, but juries don't care about that. They care about a story. And the story Jackson is telling is that he was minding his own business and got attacked by a violent woman. That plays well with certain demographics." Sarah stirred her coffee without drinking it. "Can you look into their records?" Zhang hesitated. "That would be, let's just say that's outside the normal scope of military investigation." "Why?" "Because I'd be shocked if this was the first time those 3 pushed boundaries with someone. People like that don't usually stop at just one incident." Zhang made a note. "I'll see what I can do. But Sarah, I need to be honest with you. Even if we find out they're serial harassers, that doesn't necessarily help your case. It just makes them look bad too. What we need is something that proves you acted in self-defense and didn't escalate the situation. That's our only path forward." After Zhang left, Sarah sat in her apartment as the sun went down over the base. She could see the parade grounds from her window. She could see soldiers doing evening runs. She could see the normal flow of military life continuing without her, as if she'd already been excised from the system. She thought about calling someone, her brother who lived in Arizona or her parents in Oregon. But what would she say? That she'd let herself get caught in exactly the kind of situation she'd spent 12 years learning to navigate. That she'd been so focused on not escalating that she'd forgotten the first rule of self-defense. Other people don't care about your restraint. Her phone buzzed. It was an email from Zhang. "You were right. Jackson has 2 prior complaints of sexual harassment. Both were dropped when the women declined to pursue formal investigations. We'll add to our defense strategy. Stand by." Sarah read the message 3 times. It changed nothing about her situation. It was information, but information without context. It was a small victory that wouldn't stop the larger defeat. She wasn't aware in that moment that the investigation was about to take a very different turn. She wasn't aware that someone from her past had received word about her suspension. And she definitely wasn't aware that the people she'd trained with, the people who knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of, were about to make some very important phone calls. The investigation that had seemed so damning was about to be turned inside out. But Sarah didn't know that yet. The call came on Thursday morning, and it came from a number Sarah hadn't heard from in 7 years. The voice on the other end was older, more measured, but still unmistakably that of Commander Michael Torres. Torres had been her supervisor during her time with Naval Special Warfare Command, which is the official way of saying he'd been her commanding officer when she'd been part of SEAL Team 7. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he said, and there was something in his tone that told her this wasn't a casual call. "I hear you're having some trouble." Sarah's heart did something complicated in her chest. "Sir, I'm not sure how much I can." "I know the restrictions," Torres interrupted gently. "I also know the regulations. More importantly, I know you, and I know you didn't grab those men and assault them because you felt like it. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to sit tight, and you're going to let some of us handle this." Before Sarah could respond, he hung up. Within 20 minutes, her phone rang again. This time it was from a civilian number, but the voice was that of Patricia Walls, a retired Navy attorney who had worked on classified operations for 30 years. Patricia was in her 70s now, supposedly retired, but she had the kind of connections that suggested she was never really done working. "I'm being brought in on your case," Patricia said without preamble. "I'm filing a motion with the base commander requesting that your case be reviewed by a higher authority due to concerns about bias and incomplete investigation. I'm also requesting that your classified service record be made available to the review board, given that it may be relevant to your demonstrated physical training and tactical awareness. There's a hearing scheduled for Monday." "Who authorized this?" Sarah asked. "Let's just say that some people who care about you very much called in some favors," Patricia said. "You're cleared to come to my office tomorrow to prepare. And Sarah, stop worrying. You're no longer alone in this." The line went dead. By Friday, Sarah's suspension had been modified. She was no longer confined to her apartment, though she was still suspended from active duty. Captain Zhang called to tell her that the investigation had suddenly become much more rigorous. New investigators had been brought in. The preliminary evidence was being re-examined, and perhaps most importantly, someone had leaked the records of Jackson's prior complaints to the newspaper. The local paper ran a small article on Saturday about a base commander's son repeatedly harassing female soldiers. It didn't name Sarah. That wasn't allowed due to the active investigation, but it made very clear that Jackson wasn't as innocent as he'd claimed. The article suggested that perhaps the incident at the recreation center should be understood in the context of a pattern of behavior. Jackson's father, it turned out, was Lieutenant Colonel Robert Jackson, a decorated officer with significant influence on base. The article also suggested that this might have something to do with why the original complaints had been dropped. By Monday morning, when the hearing was scheduled to begin, the entire context of the case had shifted. The hearing took place in a formal conference room in the administration building, with a panel of 3 officers who had been brought in from other bases to ensure impartiality. Patricia Walls sat next to Sarah. Across the table sat Jackson and his father, along with an officer representing the Army. Patricia presented the case methodically. She walked through the prior complaints. She presented testimony from other female soldiers who had experienced unwanted advances from Jackson. She presented character references for Sarah, not from people at Fort Parker, but from people in her classified file, people whose names couldn't be made public but whose credentials were beyond dispute. "Lieutenant Mitchell," Patricia said, turning to Sarah, "can you describe what happened in the recreation center in detail for the panel?" Sarah took a breath and told the truth. She described how the men had approached her. She described how they had persisted despite her declining. She described with clinical precision exactly what Jackson had done when he'd grabbed her wrist and exactly how she'd responded. "I controlled the situation using techniques I'd been trained in," she said. "I used the minimum force necessary to stop the threat. No one was seriously injured. I did not escalate beyond what was required by the situation. And why, one of the panel members asked, didn't you report this incident yourself? I wasn't sure I'd be believed, Sarah said simply. I've been in the military long enough to understand how these situations usually play out. Men's word against a woman's, and people with fathers of significant rank tend to do well in these situations. There was a silence. Lieutenant Colonel Jackson's face had gone red. The panel asked Jackson questions next. They asked him about the prior complaints. They asked him to describe his version of events. And they asked him directly, "Is it true that you grabbed Lieutenant Mitchell's wrist?" Jackson hesitated. His lawyer started to say something, but the panel cut him off. "I'm asking the officer directly," the panel head said. She was being dismissive," Jackson finally said. "I just wanted to get her attention." "So you did grab her wrist?" "Lightly, just to—" "Did she tell you to let go?" Jackson's mouth worked, but no words came out. "I'll take that as a yes," the panel member said. The hearing lasted another 3 hours, but the turning point had passed. By the end of the day, the panel had made their decision. Sarah was cleared of all charges. The investigation into Jackson would continue at a higher level, given the pattern of behavior and the apparent involvement of his father in suppressing previous complaints. And Sarah would be reinstated to full active duty, effective immediately. But the most significant moment came as Sarah was leaving the hearing. Patricia put a hand on her arm and pulled her aside. "There's something you should know," Patricia said. "The people who called me in, they didn't just do it because they wanted to help a fellow officer. They did it because they knew who you were. They knew what you'd done during your service. And they knew that if you went down because of 3 boys who couldn't take no for an answer, that would be a tragedy of significant proportions." Sarah didn't say anything. "You're going to get calls," Patricia continued. "People from your old unit, people from other commands, they're going to want you back. They're going to make offers. You need to think about whether you still want to be here at Fort Parker or whether you're ready for your next assignment." "What do you think I should do?" Sarah asked. Patricia smiled, sad and understanding. "I think you should do what you were always meant to do, but before you decide anything, there's one more thing." Jackson's father tried to have the panel's decision overturned. He went to the base commander, who said no. Then he called someone at the Pentagon. You know what they told him. Sarah shook her head. They told him that if he continued to interfere with the investigation, they would open a formal inquiry into his daughter's resignation from the Air Force Academy 7 years ago. Apparently, she left under circumstances that were never fully investigated. Someone with access to classified files apparently thought that timing was very interesting. Sarah's eyes widened. She understood what Patricia was saying. Someone had dug into Jackson's family history. Someone had found something. Someone had used leverage to make sure that Sarah's case would be handled fairly. "Who?" Sarah asked. "People who remember you," Patricia said. "People who knew that if you could teach them to do what you do, the least they could do was make sure you got justice." That night, Sarah sat alone in her apartment and made a decision. She would stay at Fort Parker, not because she wanted to, but because that's where the investigation into Jackson would conclude, and she wanted to be there to see it through. She wanted to watch the consequences unfold for the men who had thought that a woman's no was just the beginning of a negotiation. She wanted them to understand that there was no negotiation, that there never had been, that they had just made a mistake they would never forget. The formal investigation into Jackson took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of interviews and depositions. 6 weeks of examining conduct records and prior complaints. 6 weeks of building a case that would eventually reach the attention of the commanding general himself. Sarah watched from the sidelines as the machinery of military justice, once it finally pointed in the right direction, ground toward its inevitable conclusion. The first domino fell in early November when Jackson was formally charged with sexual harassment and assault. He was offered a choice: face a court-martial or resign with a dishonorable discharge. He chose the discharge, which saved him from the formal proceeding but branded him permanently as someone unfit to serve. His father tried to intervene. He called everyone he could reach. He invoked his rank, his service, his connections. And it worked for exactly one conversation, after which the general who had been sympathetic made a point of reviewing the entire file himself, and then called Colonel Jackson to inform him that if he continued to interfere with the military justice system, He would be relieved of command and face charges of his own. The second domino fell when it was revealed that Jackson's father had actively worked to bury the prior complaints against his son. A formal inquiry was opened into his conduct. That inquiry would ultimately result in his retirement, not the honorable kind, but the kind where it was quietly agreed that he would step down before it got worse. The third domino fell when Jackson's two friends decided that they didn't want to be associated with him anymore. One of them approached Captain Zhang and provided a statement that directly contradicted the story they'd been telling. He admitted that they had approached Sarah together, that they had persisted despite her refusal, and that Jackson had grabbed her. He admitted that when she'd responded with self-defense, they'd all decided to lie about it because they thought it would be funny. 4 men against 1 woman, and when she'd embarrassed them, they'd tried to use the system against her. By early December, the formal investigation concluded. Jackson was discharged. His father was forced to retire. 2 junior officers faced formal reprimands for their role in lying to investigators, and the base issued a formal statement about the importance of respecting boundaries and the serious consequences of sexual harassment. Sarah didn't attend any of the official proceedings. She didn't make any statements to the press or the military media. She simply returned to her duties, which involved administrative work in the operations office and training new officers in tactical awareness. But word spread, it always did. On a cold Friday morning in December, Sarah was walking across the parade grounds when she noticed something. The soldiers she passed, both men and women, gave her a different kind of attention. It wasn't the dismissive glance that had followed her before. It wasn't the rumor and speculation. It was respect. It was the kind of look people gave when they knew you had been tested and found unbreakable. That afternoon, she got a call from Commander Torres again. "You made a real impression," he said without preamble. "I just defended myself, sir." "That's exactly what I mean," Torres replied. "You defended yourself against 3 men, against a corrupt officer, against the entire system that was set up to protect them. You didn't fight back with anger. You didn't escalate. You just got up, did what was right, and let the facts speak for themselves. That's exactly the kind of character we need." "What are you saying, sir?" "I'm saying that we have an opening, a new unit, focus on different kinds of operations than what you did before. Better pay, better conditions, and more importantly, better people. You interested?" Sarah thought about it. She thought about staying at Fort Parker, where she'd been tested and had survived. She thought about going back to the world she'd known, the world of classified operations and high-stakes decisions. "Can I think about it, sir?" "You've got a month, then I need an answer." After she hung up, Sarah sat at her desk and pulled up the news on her computer. She searched for Jackson's name and found the articles about his discharge. She searched for his father's name and found the retirement announcement. She searched for herself and found nothing, which was exactly what she'd wanted. Nobody knew who she was. The public didn't know that the unnamed female officer who had been involved in the incident was a Navy SEAL. They didn't know that she'd spent the last 12 years doing things that would sound like fiction. They didn't know that she'd been tested in ways that would break most people. And they definitely didn't know that she was just getting started. What Jackson had done, approaching her, touching her, trying to use the system against her, was something she'd experienced before. Not from soldiers, but from enemy combatants. From people who believed that the rules didn't apply to them. From people who thought that might made right. She'd learned, over 12 years of service, how to handle those people. She'd learned how to remain calm when everyone else wanted her to panic. She'd learned how to act with precision and control when everyone else wanted her to lose her mind. And she'd learned that the most powerful weapon she had was the ability to survive. Jackson hadn't destroyed her. He just reminded her why she'd joined the military in the first place. On a freezing Friday night in late December, Sarah finally made her decision. She called Commander Torres. "I'm in," she said. "When do I start?" "2 weeks," Torres said. "Welcome home, Mitchell." Sarah smiled, and for the first time in months it felt real. The suspension was over. The investigation was over. The reckoning was complete. Jackson had tried to corner her with his words and his hands and his father's influence. He'd tried to make her something she wasn't. And in trying to break her, he'd reminded her exactly who she was. She was a Navy SEAL. She was a soldier. She was the kind of woman who didn't just survive in impossible situations. She excelled, and now, finally, she was going back to doing what she did best. The base threw a small going-away dinner for Sarah on her last Friday at Fort Parker. It wasn't official or formal, just a few officers and enlisted personnel who had got to know her during her 3 months there. They presented her with a plaque thanking her for her service and her leadership. Sarah accepted it graciously, said a few words about the importance of taking care of each other, and sat down to a meal of roasted chicken and too many speeches. She had seen it before, this military tradition of honoring people as they moved on to the next chapter. It was heartfelt, but it was also a ritual. Everyone said the same things. Everyone meant them, and everyone would forget about you within 6 months. What Sarah didn't expect was the final guest to arrive just as dinner was ending. She was a young woman, probably 23 or 24, in army dress uniform. Her hair was cut short, and her face had that particular combination of determination and uncertainty that marked someone still relatively new to military service. Her name tag identified her as Second Lieutenant Rebecca Morris. Sarah didn't recognize her. "Permission to speak, Lieutenant Mitchell," Rebecca said, approaching Sarah's table. "Of course," Sarah said, gesturing for her to sit. "I was one of the women who filed complaints against Jackson," Rebecca said quietly. 3 years ago, I didn't go through with it because I was scared, because I didn't think anyone would believe me, because I convinced myself it wasn't that bad." Sarah waited, understanding where this was going. "When I heard what happened with you, when I heard that you'd stood up to him, when I heard that you didn't back down," Rebecca's voice wavered slightly, "it made me realize that I should have done the same thing. I should have fought harder. So I came to talk to you because I wanted to say thank you, not just for standing up for yourself, but for reminding me that I wasn't wrong to feel what I felt, that my no should have been enough." Sarah reached across the table and took Rebecca's hand. "You weren't wrong," she said simply, "and you're not alone, not anymore." Rebecca's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She was military, after all, but Sarah could see something in her expression shift. It was acceptance. It was permission. It was the knowledge that someone else understood what had happened to her and validated that it was wrong. "What are you going to do now?" Sarah asked. "I'm thinking about filing a new complaint," Rebecca said. "Now that everything's out in the open about Jackson, the system might actually listen this time." "The system should," Sarah said. "And if it doesn't, there are people who will, people who care about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." After Rebecca left, Sarah stood on the parade ground and looked out at Fort Parker in the darkness. She could see the distant lights of the barracks, the motor pool, the administration building where she'd sat in Major Reeves's office 2 months ago and watched her entire career nearly crumble. She thought about what Patricia Walls had said about people remembering her, about people who had cared enough to make sure she got justice. She thought about how many other women were in situations like Rebecca's, knowing they were right, knowing they were wronged, but not having the support system or the confidence to fight back. She thought about how many female soldiers, female officers, female service members were going through Fort Parker, and 1,000 other bases exactly like it, trying to navigate a system that wasn't always designed with them in mind. And she made a promise to herself. She was going back to her unit. She was going to do the work she was trained to do, but she was going to remember Fort Parker. She was going to remember the moment when 3 men had thought they could corner a woman and take what wasn't theirs to take. She was going to remember Rebecca's wavering voice saying thank you. And every woman who had to make the same choice Sarah had made, to stand up and risk everything, or to stay silent and let it happen again. Sarah was going to make sure they knew they weren't alone. That was her mission now, not just as a soldier, but as a human being. The next morning, Sarah packed her car with the few personal items she'd accumulated at Fort Parker. She left the plaque on her desk for the next person who would occupy the office. She turned in her base credentials. She filled out her discharge paperwork and got her final medical clearance. And as she drove through the gates of Fort Parker for the last time in her current assignment, she didn't look back. She was thinking about the future instead, about the new unit, about the work that was waiting, about all the ways she could use her experience, her strength, and her survival to help others. But she was also thinking about Jackson, about where he was right now, about what he was feeling as his career came to an end, as his father retired in disgrace, as the entire network of protection that had enabled his behavior unraveled around him. She was thinking about how he'd tried to corner her, and how that mistake would define the rest of his life. She was thinking about how she'd survived it, how she'd come out the other side stronger, clearer, more certain of who she was. And if she could do that, survive being tested and come out unbreakable, then maybe the next woman who found herself in a similar situation would know it was possible too. 3 months later, Sarah received a letter forwarded to her new unit. It was from Rebecca Morris. Rebecca had filed her complaint. The investigation had concluded. Jackson was being called back for questioning, but this time with full knowledge of his history and full support from the military system. The case had also prompted a base-wide review of how sexual harassment complaints were being handled. Rebecca ended her letter with a simple message. "Thank you for showing me that no really does mean no. Thank you for being the kind of woman that little girls can look at and say, 'I want to be like her.' You reminded me who I was supposed to be." Sarah read the letter 3 times. Then she filed it carefully in a drawer in her new office. She had chosen the life of a soldier. She had chosen a path that required constant testing, constant evaluation, constant willingness to be broken down and rebuilt. But standing there in her new office, halfway through her first week with her new unit, Sarah realized that the hardest battles weren't the ones you fought in the field. They were the ones you fought on military bases, in recreation centers, in offices with commanders who didn't believe you. And she realized that surviving those battles was just as important as any tactical operation. Maybe more important, because when you survived a battle like that, you did more than just save yourself. You sent a message to every woman who was watching. You showed them that it was possible, that standing up for yourself didn't have to mean being aggressive or angry. It just meant being clear, being certain, being unbreakable. Sarah Mitchell had spent 12 years learning to be a Navy SEAL. But it wasn't until Fort Parker, until those 3 men cornered her in a recreation center and tried to make her something she wasn't, that she truly understood what that meant. It meant remembering. It meant carrying the weight of every woman who had been silenced. It meant standing up, even when the entire system was arranged against you. It meant surviving, and then using that survival to help someone else. It meant being the kind of woman that people couldn't forget. The kind of woman that people would eventually have to respect. The kind of woman who didn't just survive impossible situations. She changed them. 3 months ago, Jackson had grabbed her wrist and told her to loosen up. 3 months later, he was receiving formal letters requesting he return for questioning. His discharge was being reconsidered. His father was under investigation, and everywhere on Fort Parker, women were finding their voices again. Sarah Mitchell had come to Fort Parker unknown and unremarkable. She had left it unforgettable. And the real work, the work that mattered, was only just beginning.